Hi, everyone. My name's John Lindsey, and I'm an assistant professor of voice at Colorado State University. Um, and I was invited by Dr. Autumn West to present a little bit on trauma-informed pedagogy, which is something that I've spent about the last 10 years or so um, training in, researching, and applying in my own voice instruction. So having this as part of the mindful voice, I think is really fascinating because one of the things that I have found over the years is that um, being trauma aware, trauma sensitive, trauma informed, we'll kind of talk about some of these levels later in the presentation. Um, Above anything else, it's a kind of awareness practice. It's taking stock of what's really happening in this lesson right now. What is the pattern of communication between who's in the room with me and myself? What am I noticing in terms of our relational dynamic, in terms of responses to instruction, in terms of my responses to how the lesson's going? Things like this. Um, Additionally, I've held a contemplative practice for about the past 15 years or so, um, meditating and being certified to teach meditation. Um, I have two certifications in trauma sensitive meditation and mindfulness instruction as well. And I've noticed how often those same principles and those same skills come up in the voice lesson setting. So Um, today's going to be sort of a foundational primer for trauma-informed practice. There are many, many resources about this, um, but we'll start with this today, which is primarily what I consider to be the foundation of any kind of trauma-informed practice, um, and that's being relationally oriented in our musical instruction. So we'll talk a little bit about what trauma is, some of the definitions of it, how it shows up. Then we'll get into a little bit of how we can be mindful of this in the voice studio and how we can use it to enhance our students' experiences of lessons, as well as our instruction, as well as the relationship that we form with the people we work with. So Uh, to begin, I would say think of a time when you were overwhelmed by a situation. Um, as you think of a situation that felt overwhelming, I would invite you to not go to something that was incredibly difficult. Okay, let's go to something like I was really stressed out about how many assignments I had to get in for class, or I had this really big project due and I wasn't sure what to do it. Or for those of us who are educators, um, I had this class prep and I was a little bit behind on it, or there was some kind of a research assignment that I needed to get on top of, or I was giving a recital, something that feels overwhelming, but not um, really activating. Okay? So think of one of those and just hold it lightly for a few seconds before you let it go. Okay. Hopefully, we all feel just a little overwhelmed, but not too much. Um, we did that because this is a definition of trauma that I really appreciate. It's from Scott Giacomucci, who runs a trauma clinic out near Philadelphia. And he says that the clinical definition of trauma is a wound that results from any experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope. So, an experience just being overwhelming in and of itself, feeling overwhelming in and of itself, does not mean that we can't cope with that experience. It's very possible to say, oh, I feel really overwhelmed. I'm fatigued. I have too much to do. There's not enough time. But we can still find a way to cope with that overwhelm, right? It's when overwhelm takes over any ability that we have to cope with that difficult situation that trauma becomes much, much more likely. A big thing that can determine this overwhelm is what we call the window of tolerance. This was coined by Dan Siegel um, back in the 1990s. Dr. Daniel Siegel is a clinical psychologist, major developer of attachment theory, the development of the brain, and now large proponent of interpersonal neurobiology. Um, and he coined this idea of what he called the window of tolerance. So we've got an ideal place here in the middle where this yellow squiggly line is that allows us to be present and to adapt and to learn. If we get outside of that window, either too high up, we become anxious or angry or reactive, or if we drop down below the window where we dissociate, we numb out, um, we feel a sense of shame about whatever we're dealing with, or some kind of feeling of helplessness. Anytime we get to either extreme of this, all of a sudden, it's much more likely that whatever the situation is, even if that situation is being in a voice lesson, it can overwhelm our ability to cope and adapt. If that overwhelm happens, there are two different kinds of trauma, broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, that we can recognize. So there's big T trauma, which is exposure to generally a single event, not always, but generally, some kind of a single event that was incredibly overwhelming, felt life-threatening or was life-threatening, um, and put us into a state of um, overwhelm and shock. So exposure to violence or the threat of death, war, natural disaster, um, some kind of a major accident, like a major car crash, something like that. This is big T trauma, a single event. Uh, Little t trauma is what we would consider like lower intensity, but more frequent. Yeah, so where big T trauma is a single event generally, um, that results in this huge sense of overwhelm. Little t trauma is lower intensity, but happens more often over time. So things like neglect, um, bullying can cause this, like really pervasive and frequent and unrelenting bullying. Chronic emotional overwhelm, consistent harsh criticism. It can happen on an inner level too, with a sense of perfectionism and shame. Usually that comes from voices that we've internalized from the outside, or what we would call the inner critic potentially. All of these can potentially lend themselves to what we would call little t trauma, where it's this extended period of our loss of an ability to cope with a given situation or with specific situations. How prevalent is trauma? Um, estimates vary, but in a sample population noted by Bruce Kessler, um, adult uh, adult respondent rates of exposure to potentially traumatic events were as high as 82.7%. So most of us at some point in our life will be exposed to a potentially traumatic event, one of these single events that can be a cause of big T trauma. That does not mean that we will be traumatized, but it means that the event itself has a high likelihood of causing it if we are overwhelmed by it. Um, An additional fact to note is that conservative estimates using the ACEs inventory, so Adverse Child Experiences Survey. Um, it's what we call the ACEs inventory. Note that approximately 72 and a half of US adults have experienced at least one ACE before the age of 18, and nearly 18% experiencing four of these or more. So items on the ACEs inventory include a parent being incarcerated, abuse within the home, mental illness of a parent, um, potential suicide attempts by a parent, economic hardship, things of that nature. Um, these are these are instances that can result in big T or little t trauma. In terms of when we actually diagnose uh, trauma in the system and the echoes of that trauma continuing to affect daily life in a really significant way, that's what we would call PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. So about 5% of all US adults experience PTSD. This is according to diagnoses, recorded diagnoses. This is not according to anecdotal reports of PTSD. It's very possible that more than 5% of adults in the US experience PTSD and simply haven't been diagnosed. We don't really know. But as far as the data shows, about 5% of all US adults um, have been diagnosed with PTSD. Rates are higher for women in general. They're about double compared to men. They're also higher in specific populations versus the general population. So, for example, the veterans population experiences 16% PTSD diagnosis as a woman or 8% PTSD diagnosis as a man compared to the general populace, respectively. In addition to PTSD, which is the diagnosis in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5. It's sort of like the text that mental health professionals lean on for diagnosis. There's another diagnosis that is recognized internationally, but not officially recognized here in the United States. That's called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. This accounts for a smaller amount of reported cases. Again, we can't say diagnosed cases here because it's not an official diagnosis in the United States, even though it is everywhere else. Um, this is associated with a wider set of trauma-associated behaviors. So PTSD is generally associated with big T trauma in terms of what is outlined in the DSM-5. CPTSD is much more likely to be associated with little t trauma or childhood trauma. So ongoing incidences of um, some kind of a living circumstance, relationship, sequence of events that was ongoing that resulted in this traumatic wounding and inability to regulate that then gets internalized. In terms of Our work uh, as educators, potentially as students, if you're a student watching this, we have levels of how to be aware of trauma, uh, both in our work at school, in our workplace otherwise. So I've divided it into five different layers. Um, the sort of base layer is being trauma aware. So I'm aware that trauma exists in the population that I work with. Then there's trauma sensitive. Um, Same thing. I'm aware that trauma exists in the population I work with, and I've developed measures to make room for that experience. Being trauma informed is the next step. So I've developed measures to make room for the experience of trauma. I also have a foundational knowledge of trauma and its effect on people and their relationships or how they relate with one another. The level after that is trauma responsive. So all of the previous qualifiers. And then additionally, I've undergone training and education to be able to respond in situations that arise from the impacts of trauma. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. Then the sort of, however you want to think about it, farthest along or highest tier is being trauma focused. This level is exclusive to clinicians in the mental health field, as well as music therapists. Um, so everything we've just talked about, and additionally, the focus of my work is to explore, treat, and advise on trauma, its root causes, and its effects. So this trauma focus level is a place that we do not go as voice teachers. To maintain an ethical scope of practice, we don't try to treat trauma or resolve trauma or integrate trauma in any of the work that we do. The most we can do is get to the point where we are trauma responsive, in that we have specific tools that we can offer to somebody we are working with who may be experiencing some kind of trauma-related impact in their nervous system or in their behavior or in their ability to relate, to help them sort of ground into the space, um, reestablish a sense of regulation and ability to be present rather than caught in the impacts of this wound. Yeah. But we do not tell them how they're going to work with that, resolve that. We don't diagnose. These are very, very crucial points. Yeah, and I would say uh, it takes many, many years of working up to being trauma responsive. It takes a long time. And so we're talking about sort of finding a foundational understanding of how we can recognize some of the impacts of trauma in the voice lesson setting, but we're not trying to jump into, well, how do I really help there? Or how do I become responsive? That takes time. It takes time and training and a lot of intentionality, yeah, and care. Which leads me to what would we consider trauma-informed practice in music? Um, so this is how I describe it. Yeah, this is not a pre-existing definition. This is how I describe it. This is music instruction, which prioritizes the subjective experience of the student in the lesson with us. It prioritizes their experience, both past and present, and the possible impact of trauma within that experience. Yeah, that's what being trauma informed means to me. So, seeing the subjective experience of the person that I'm working with, both leading up to our relationship, or more specifically, this given lesson, as well as what's happening right now in the lesson, and knowing that it's possible that some kind of trauma could impact our work together. That's what being trauma informed is. In terms of trauma informed principles, um, I very much appreciate SAMHSA's 6 principles of trauma informed practice. It's kind of the gold standard that we have here in the United States for this kind of work. So those principles are safety, trust and transparency, peer support, collaboration or mutuality, voice and choice, or what I refer to as agency, and cultural humility, not assuming we know where people are coming from or what has shaped them over time. Trusting them to share that with us rather than assuming that I know. So, as kind of a primer to um, trauma-informed practice, rather than trying to get really familiar with all 6 of those facets, rather than trying to become trauma responsive right off the bat, I generally invite and encourage people to go with a list of 3, which I call the 3 C's. It's a foundation to relationally oriented practice, which can eventually lead into this more trauma-informed place. And those three C's are communication, connection, and compassion. And we're going to talk about each one. Um, Relationally oriented practice is an instructional relationship that prioritizes communication, connection, and compassionate relating. Um, I tie each of these 3 C's into some of the 6 principles so that you can kind of relate them and see how they fit together. It's simplified and a bit more intuitive for the beginning of trauma-informed practice. Um, and I really strongly believe that any trauma-informed or well-being oriented or mental health conscious pedagogy needs to be built on being relationally oriented. Um, we are not here to fix anybody. As singers or as people, I'm editorializing now. This is just more of my personal philosophy. But I'm not here to fix anybody's voice, and I'm not here to fix what happened to anybody. But what I am here to do is to be present with them in a really deep, authentic, open, and vulnerable way so that we can find our way forward in terms of the artistic process. Um, so that's why I'm starting with this. Um, I also have done work on sort of the next step up from this, which I call the SAFE method. If you are interested in that, I wrote an article about it in the Nats Journal that was published earlier this year. And we'll be putting a presentation about that together soon as well. But this is a good place to start. So the first C is communication. Um, Everything about how we are present in a space, both internally and externally, is communicative. So, how we're dressed, the rhythm of our speech, how much eye contact we maintain, the amount of physical gesture we use, the speed at which we move. All of these things are subtly communicating to the person that we're with. Um, Our physical lesson space, additionally, can communicate what priorities are to the people that we work with. So, for example, I'm in my office. Um, I've made several, well, maybe more than several kind of adjustments to the space in order for people to hopefully find some of these six principal facets that you see on your screen: safety, agency, and collaboration. So over on my door over here, I have a shade over the window, which can be there or it can be removed so people can or cannot see into the room. It's entirely up to the person I'm working with whether they have that on or not. Um, I have lamps everywhere, so lighting can be adjusted. I have a blanket and a comfy chair for if people are feeling overwhelmed or need a bit of comfort. It also helps regulate temperature. I've had people sing with the blanket on before when it's really chilly. I live in Colorado, so it gets quite cold here sometimes. Um, the walls are painted sage green because it tends to have a calming effect, according to neuroscientific papers I've read. Um, Absence or presence of scents are up to a student. Things like that. I have a bunch of sort of fidget toys or motor activity toys over here on the piano. So I've really tried to be very intentional with the lesson space, um, to where it's not actually about me in here, in this office. It's about the space being comfortable and adaptable for the people that I am welcoming in and working with. So all of these kind of subtle forms of communication are where I'm starting from here. So some things to notice in ourselves in terms of communication. What's the tone of our voice? If I talk to you like this, it's really, really different than if I talk to you like this. There's a very distinct difference in the way that I'm received, depending on what the tone of my voice is, the variation in pitch, um, kind of the amount of space that I leave in between sentences. If I'm talking really fast and very harsh and very declamatory, it's going to land super differently than if things are a little bit slower. Facial expressions. So, how animated are we? Do we have a really flat affect? Do we look really frustrated? Do we look tired? All of these things are things that we're subtly communicating, whether we are aware of it or not. How our bodies are moving. I mentioned this already. How we model technical exercises for the people we work with is very communicative. Am I always singing an exercise forte? Am I always singing an exercise piano? What am I what am I trying to communicate there? How do we characterize or mimic a student's singing? Um, in particular, um, I've been with many teachers and coaches where I would sing a phrase and they would sing back to me an imitation of what they perceived that I did. Sometimes there was some kind of a disclaimer about, like, this is an exaggeration, this isn't exactly what you're doing, but it's in the direction and it's something I want us to watch out for. Other people would outright, uh, almost mockingly parody what I just did in an attempt to find technical change. Are we doing that? It's an important thing to note. Um, for voice teachers, how are we playing the piano? How heavy is our touch or light? What speed are we playing these exercises? How we verbalize thoughts, concepts, and guidance. This has a lot to do with the SAFE method that I wrote about, utilizing nonviolent communication in terms of how we teach. Um, but how sort of brusque or frank are we being in our feedback or critical versus how observational are we being? Observational and invitational in terms of what we're putting out there for students to absorb. Are we noticing um, our students' level of engagement? Are we just going through the motions without really taking in how it's affecting the person we're working with? Um, do we just want to be have our instructions followed and complied with, or are we really looking to see where the student is coming from and why something might be happening technically, or why this phrase might be really difficult, or why we've been working on this piece for 4 weeks and it just doesn't seem to click, you know? Are we looking to understand, or do we just want to be understood? Um, Again, ties into the SAFe method a little bit, but can we pivot from evaluative language? So, you're not tuning well. We got to do that again. Versus observational language, where we're making requests. We're seeing what we can do collaboratively. So I notice I didn't hear as many upper partials on that top note. Could we try the phrase again? You know? All of these have an impact on the regulation or dysregulation, not only of our lesson participant, but ourselves. Yeah? If we're getting really, really worked up and frustrated because the changes that we are hoping to facilitate are not happening, uh, that's going to be felt in the space. I mentioned earlier Dan Siegel and his research into interpersonal neurobiology. One of the things that he posits is that we co-regulate together. So if one of us becomes really dysregulated and frustrated or angry or upset, the other person will take that on in all likelihood at some level, unless they've done a lot of work to cultivate equanimity, this like steadiness of their own nervous system. Um, One of the things that I always invite uh, voice teachers to is that in a voice lesson setting where we are dealing with um, somebody else's unique, individual um, voice that cannot be replicated, and that is the way that they express themselves in the world, things can get really, really intense, really fast. Somebody in the lesson needs to have a level head, and it needs to be you as a teacher. So the sort of takeaway from uh, this uh, this kind of communication piece is that uh, relationally oriented communication can be non-judgmental, collaborative, and actionable rather than evaluative, diagnostic, and critical. So, to follow the communication portion of things that we just covered, the next C that we're going to work with is connection. So, open, non-judgmental communication can lead to connection, empathy, and what's called unconditional positive regard. This is a term that was coined by Carl Rogers, who was a humanistic psychologist of the 20th century. Um, and the definition of unconditional positive regard is accepting a human's being worth, experience, and personality without any evaluation or expectations of them. That's kind of a tall order sometimes, but it is something that we can cultivate through this open, non-judgmental communication and the connection that it leads into. Trust and shared values are cultivated and prioritized in terms of forming connection with others. And the SAMHSA six principal sort of facets that this relates to are those of trust and transparency, peer support, and collaboration. Um, while there is a power dynamic at play in virtually every voice lesson that we engage in, at some level, we are still peers, right? At the level of we are both human beings in this room. We can meet there as peers and we can support one another and we can collaborate on the goals that we have and we can learn to trust one another. So in terms of connection, we're going to look at things we might notice in the student. As we talked about communication, we addressed things to notice in ourselves. When it comes to connection, we'll talk about things to notice in the student. So, what is the frequency and ease of eye contact that we're able to make? This is not a one-off indicator in any way, because sometimes if people are neurodivergent, eye contact can be more limited. It also might be very fixed. That can also have to do with general personality traits. It can have to do with a whole spectrum of things. However, eye contact can also be an indicator of comfortability. So kind of noting that and possibly even checking in. One of the things that I often do in first voice lessons is I'll check in with whoever I'm working with about, hey, how does eye contact feel? I promise I'm never just going to like stare at you, but is it okay that we're meeting eyes once in a while? Does that feel comfortable to you, or does it need to change around a little bit? Closed versus open body language. So having a singer stand the entire lesson like this while you're doing your exercises and stand far away from the piano is very different than having somebody with a bit more open body language as you're working together. Um, Additionally, if they start open, but all of a sudden you start to work a technical aspect or some kind of facet of repertoire preparation or something like that, and they gradually close off or sort of shut down physically, these are things to notice and take stock of. Maybe pause. Say, hey, I'm wondering if maybe we're working a little bit too hard or getting into something that feels uncomfortable. I'd like to just check in with you, you know? Um, if you notice some kind of consistency when it comes to hesitation, nervousness, resistance to vocal exercises or repertoire work, um, getting curious about that. If every time we get to a certain part of the range, and the person we're working with goes, "Oh, I hate this exercise," or like, "Gosh, we always do this, and I don't like it. I don't like being up there." Or if we're working on blending the two registers together. I mean, two registers, bear with me. I know that there's more nuance than that, but if we're working between mode one and mode two and we're trying to ease some of that transition, and the person consistently looks really uncomfortable and stops doing the exercises. Checking in there, making sure that the physical coordination that's necessary for some of the technical elements that we want to offer students and the uncomfortability that accompanies those, that it's staying within that window of tolerance we're talking about, and that we're not taking them into territory where they feel really, really exposed, you know? Um, if you notice emotional overwhelm, so you get into a lesson and tears or explosive reactions of anger or rage or um, flat affect or even full out dissociation start to happen. These are big red flags for us that whatever we're doing we need to either slow way down or stop altogether, because that means that the person that we are working with is out of that window of tolerance, right? They're into either the top portion or the bottom portion. And no matter how much work we try to do together in terms of these technical pieces, it's not going to be beneficial long term. Uh, I have been in plenty of voice lessons or coachings where somebody just yelled at me until I did what they wanted. And eventually there was some kind of a result, and I got all kinds of congratulations and positive reinforcement and everything else. Do you think I remembered how to do what they asked the next time? Absolutely not, right? The circuits in the brain related to learning shut down when the circuits in the brain that are connected to the fight or flight response, this activation of the limbic system, learning shuts down. The learning and adaptation processes in the brain stop functioning, essentially. So you can still get somebody to get a result out of the motor cortex, but they probably won't know how to repeat that. Noticing compliance versus curiosity. So this ties in a little bit to the example I just gave. Um, I was trying to be compliant in these lessons where somebody was yelling at me to do something better. I wasn't very curious about how I was doing it or what I was doing or um, how I would fit that in the next time I did the piece. I was just trying to get somebody to stop yelling at me. So, noticing, is somebody meeting you with this like a flat affect and just going, okay, all right, yeah. Or are they getting frustrated and angry because you're having them do the same thing over and over again? Or they sing two or three notes and you keep stopping them and you see them getting upset, right? I don't believe anybody watching this video does those things, but I certainly have been in lessons where that's happened. Versus this place where they feel able to go, oh, why do we actually do that way? Like, can you tell me a little bit more about what some of the technical adjustments we're making are doing? You know, those are two very different mindsets. Um, and then additionally, equity in verbal communication. So, as I just mentioned, um, does the person in the room with you feel able and allowed to say, why are we doing what we're doing? Or can you tell me more about what we're doing? Or um, I'd like to understand a little bit more about how we're approaching some of this. Like, can we talk through that? Do they have a space to describe their experience and to develop their vocabulary about their own instrument and their own process? I find that to be incredibly beneficial in terms of the artistic process and the art of singing. If somebody can actually connect these motor cortex processes to the verbal circuits in the brain and be able to cognitively talk that out with you, that's a pretty good indicator of the type of learning that we're doing, that we're learning at multiple levels of comprehension in terms of what we're doing. So, empathetic connection can really lead to a lot more compassionate relating and compassionate presence and action with one another. So, the kind of takeaway from this is that connection is the next step. It builds on non-judgmental communication and it cultivates trust, shared values, and unconditional positive regard over time. So, again, over time, everything we're talking about here is over time. Do you notice? None of this is like we walk into a lesson and this just happens. This is a gradual, um, cultivated, intentional process that we're hoping to engage here. So I'd like to say that because I don't want anybody watching this to think, Oh, well, I just had a first lesson and it really didn't seem like we were able to find this connection and I'm not sure how compassionate we're being with one another. That's not the expectation. Yeah. This is stuff that will come with time. So over time, our non-judgmental communication, our connection, this empathy and positive regard for one another begin to mature in both the lesson facilitator and the lesson participant, or teacher and student, if you like. So, kind of the next step to that unfolding is compassionate relating and presence, as well as compassionate action. I'd like to define a little bit of this, what I mean by compassion. I don't mean pity, I don't mean sympathy, I don't mean empathy. Empathy is useful, but empathy is not compassion. Empathy is feeling with another person or feeling, more accurately, feeling what they're feeling, having some of this resonance in the body with their experience and mirror neurons firing and all of that. It's also not insincere or coddling. Insincerity and coddling are insincerity and coddling. That's when we're just trying to get somebody through something by being nice and not actually authentic to what's happening. Uh, However, compassion does mean the recognition of and movement toward acknowledging feelings and fulfilling needs, if we can, which we can't always, much as we would like. And giving ourselves space to refer out or turning towards another need. So when we can't meet the needs in front of us, what do we do with that? Do we say, well, let me see if I can find somebody who can really meet you there? Um, if we have a student in the room with us and they say, uh, I'm really afraid because there's this guy that's been following me home after class every day, and I feel really scared and I don't know what to do about it. I, within my ethical scope of practice, cannot resolve that situation. But I can say, hey, you know what? I think, what do you need here? Like, should we get you to the campus police station, which I've done? Can I get you connected with Title IX so that we can uh, talk about what's happening, refer you to other campus resources, be here so that you know that you have somebody you can tell this to? That's something where I can't immediately resolve that issue or meet that need, but I can refer out. And I can also pivot to another need, which is what do you need right now in terms of feeling safe right now in this moment? What can we do? So sort of two different possibilities if we're unable to meet specific needs. But I made this little sort of chart here that where I have some phrases that describe the differences. So pity is I'm better off than you. Um, that's that's the place we don't want to go. Sympathy is I feel for you. Empathy is I feel with you. Compassion is I'm here with and for you, right? So notice that empathy is within the circle of compassion. Empathy is a component of compassion, but it's also the recognition that whatever we are feeling, it's not exclusively ours. It's here in the space. It's a relational thing. So I'm here with that. And also, I'm here for that. I'm here to meet the need behind what that feeling is, if possible. Then eventually it turns into what I call cyclical compassion, which is we are here with and for one another. So this cycle of compassion kind of starts to perpetuate itself. Uh, And this is what makes getting through really difficult lessons or really difficult semesters or really difficult um, uh, benchmarks and barriers and that sort of thing throughout education. Uh, this is what makes that possible. So in this category, um, the things to notice in both the people we're working with and ourselves. Can we articulate, recognize, feel without judgment? Can we recognize these things, our feelings and needs, um, in ourselves and in the people that we are working with? Um, can we meet these needs by using skills of non-judgmental communication and connection? Are we trying to, and when I say meet a need, this is important. When I say needs, I'm talking about universal human needs. So, a need for safety, a need for exploration, a need for understanding, a need for connection. These are universal human needs. If you'd like to know more about what those are, I would invite you to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs or look up NVC, list of feelings and needs. So in nonviolent communication, we usually have an enormous list of feelings that we're referencing, along with a big list of universal human needs. A need is different than a demand or a want. Like, I want you to do that phrase well again, which is like, I would say maybe a little bit problematic on a couple of levels. Um, that's a want. A demand would be do that phrase again and get it right. A need would be I need to make sure that we're both understanding what we need in that phrase there. So let's just review and double check some things. Um, I got a little bit sidetracked there. But in any case, can we meet these needs uh, through this non-judgmental cycle? Um, does the lesson dynamic feel open and spacious and exploratory and fun? Or does it feel, you know, does it feel like every time we get into a lesson together, there's this kind of constricted, tight um, web of expectation and apprehension and hesitance and, any number of things that just feel constricted and not as free, because that will translate into the singing. It's almost impossible for it not to, aside from just like sheer force of will. And that is possible, but I've also found that there's a price over time. After the lesson, do both of us feel really content or accomplished, um, nourished by the experience? Or are we exhausted and frustrated and demoralized? We all are going to have tough lessons. We're all going to have lessons where things don't go the way that we were hoping, either as an instructor or as a student. We're all going to have them. That's not what's at issue here. What's at issue is how we meet those moments. And do we meet those moments together in a way that is supportive of the learning process? Or are we meeting them in a way that um, fosters shame and discouragement? These are important things. This aspect contains all six of the SAMHSA principles. The simplest way to say be trauma informed is to say be compassionate. Full stop. It's a simple thing to do. It's also a very difficult thing to do sometimes. Here's our takeaway. Compassion's not pity, coddling, or a need to fix. It's a holding space where a process of meeting needs is allowed to grow and unfold. So I'm asking you, if you're watching this, to fulfill um, a very specific role as an instructor. And if you are still watching, that is of interest to you. If it's not of interest to you, you probably stopped watching a while ago. You may be able to tell this isn't easy. This is not the easy path. Um, and you will need as much care to engage this as the people that you work with. Um, Teachers are at an enormously high risk of burnout and the physical symptoms of burnout, fatigue, resignation, inability to complete tasks, reduced executive functioning. Um, this is whether you engage in trauma-informed practice or not. This is it's it's really endemic to the profession. This this factor of burnout. So we have to offer ourselves care by meeting our own needs. It allows us to meet the needs of others, and it's the beginning of cyclical compassion. Through compassion satisfaction, there's actually a term. They primarily use this in the medical field. Most of the research that has been done to this point about compassion and self-compassion is in healthcare professionals. I would love to see more of it about educators because it's equally important. So, here are some self-compassion domains you could potentially think about. Um, some of us may see this list and go, oh my gosh, 7 domains where I have all of these things I have to take care of for myself when I can hardly um, get a shower and get the kids out the door and take care of all the emails I have and everything else, or whatever it may be. I've got to get my dogs out the door before I get back to rehearsal. Uh, please don't try to tackle all of these at once, but find one where you read it and you go, yeah, that's really important. You know, um, yeah, I really am at work all the time. I just need to make sure that I call a friend every once in a while and talk about how things are going. Or I I really want to understand more about this trauma-informed practice thing because it makes me feel empowered instead of helpless. So I'm gonna get a book about it, or I'm gonna enroll in a course about it. Um, but have a look through some of these while we're on this slide and see where are some places where I can tend to my well-being by um, engaging in some self-compassionate investment in one of these. For me, it's a meditation practice, actually. If I allow myself the space to sit for 30 to 60 minutes every day, it doesn't have to be that long. Sometimes I have to take 5 minutes at a time, several times throughout the day. But this constant resting down and back out of the wheel of thinking into awareness. This can be um, profoundly helpful. I would conclude by offering that being trauma informed is work that never ends. It only deepens. So it doesn't matter how many certificates we have. It doesn't matter how many books we've read. It doesn't matter how many interventions we've been offered in terms of some of this trauma responsive stuff we were talking about earlier. It is always, always, always a practice, and a practice is something that deepens over time. Um, However, nuanced and advanced aspects of a practice may benefit from some kind of training or certification. I believe Megan Durham and Elisa Monti are in the process through their website of making a certificate. I think it's between a 1 and 2 year certificate with supervision, and it's quite involved, and it looks really, really wonderful. I'm also in the process of designing uh, a certificate program that is more abbreviated, more of a foundational starting point for folks who are interested and engaged in this kind of work. But you can find others um, in terms of general trauma-informed education, certifications, things like that. So if some of this more in-depth training calls to you, I would encourage you to look for those opportunities. Um, all of that being said, the foundations of this can always be practiced through the three C's we talked about today. So, communication, connection, compassion with our students and ourselves. These are um, these are incredibly important things that we can offer one another and ourselves. And it sustains this work. It really does, in my experience. Thank you for listening to my talk. I'm really grateful if you took the time to listen all the way through. Um, I have a list of some of the sources I used here. I'll have this slide deck offered alongside the presentation, so you can have it to reference if you would like. Um, but in the meantime, um, I'm very appreciative of the fact that you are interested in this approach. Um, and if you have any other questions or ever want to talk about it, uh, please feel free to get in touch with me. You can find my contact information through Dr. West's website, um, and you can also just find me through my faculty page at Colorado State University in the voice area here. So um, I wish you well on your journey with all of this.